So Konami just announced that Tengu Plant is going to be playable in their Ultimate Time Wizard event at YCS Vegas. And while this is phenomenal for Tengu Plant format, one thing I think we can all be aware of is going into this event, there's going to be a lot of inexperienced Tengu Plant players playing for their team, and that means you're going to see an oversaturation of people playing Tengu Plants and Agents. If you came up with the brilliant idea to play one of those decks at this event, you're probably not alone. There's going to be a lot of people playing it. So as a result, I think it would be really helpful to some of you newer Tengu Plant players to understand how exactly you approach beating those two decks, because quite frankly, there are a lot of viable decks in Tengu Plant format, way more than just Tengu Plants and Agents, and if you want to go into playing one of those other decks versus these decks, I think it would be important to understand how to approach beating them. So that's what this guide is going to be. We're going to talk about Agents first, then Tengu Plants, and you guys can let me know if this was helpful and if there's any other decks you want to know how to beat. So we'll just hop right into it. Agents is one of the most highly regarded decks in Tengu Plant format, and while the deck is strong, I personally think its strength lies in players playing versus the deck poorly, as well as its massive oversaturation in the format will inherently boost its results. The deck abuses large boss monsters to steal games from opponents, but to fully understand what Agents do, we first need to look at a common build. So this is probably the most cookie cutter agent build you can find. I've seen this list top multiple times, or at least lists very similar to this. This is kind of the go-to standard thing for agents. And what honestly I'm gonna teach you, once you see it, you probably can't unsee it. And I hope you kind of understand where I'm coming from when I say I don't really feel like this deck is as strong as people think. If this is your first time ever seeing agents, let me walk you through the very fundamental things this deck does. Its primary plays are normal summon a Venus, use its effect to summon Shine Balls, and then make a Gotchi Gotchi. So you're going to have a 2k monster on the field with a Gotchi, right? You know, that's pretty much its primary initial turn one play. You know, in reality, Agents actually only has 3 ideal turn 1 plays, and it's based on its normal summon, right? So it's Venus into Shine Ball into Gotchi, or it's normal summon Earth and search a Venus, or lastly, it's normal summon Tour Guide and get a Sangan, which is then going to be used to search an Earth, which is then going to be used to search the Venus. You see where I'm going with this, right? So that's basically what all the normal summons in this deck do. It's like these are the only cards you're really going to normal summon outside of exactly Jupiter, which, you know, it's basically just there as an extra name, and, you know, it can also kind of pump to get over something big like a Thunder King or something. It has its purposes. Some people like it. I'm not a fan, but, you know, to each their own. But then we got to look at the boss monsters, because the boss monsters is what actually makes this deck pretty strong, right? This is where the deck actually has its relevancy. So you have Hyperion, which effect is you can banish an agent from hand, field, or graveyard to special summon it, and then you can banish a fairy monster from your graveyard, any fairy monster, to pop a card on the field. Pretty strong, relatively generic removal, right? 2700 attack, has OTK potential relatively. It's a pretty good card. The other card we have is Archlord Christia, which I personally think is probably the best card that agents have in its arsenal. This is like the card that I think can steal the most games out of any card in the deck. I think Hyperion is like, it's strong, but it's not like you can't special summon strong. You know, Archlord Christia being a 2800 beater says neither player can special summon. The fact that you can easily manipulate your graveyard in agents does make this card a bit pesky to get rid of, because like even if you, let's say, dark hole it, you put it to the top of their deck, they can just draw and then find a way to special summon it again, right? It's just kind of an annoying card to deal with, so it's something to think about. This is probably the most threatening card that you're going to have to deal with. Then the other cards that, like other boss monsters we can talk about, are going to be like, I mean, Gors and Trag. These cards are only good if you play into them. You know, it's actually really easy to read these cards and play around them. Basically, just don't attack directly unless you can out these cards, right? It's not that complex. But this is basically these cards, I think, steal games versus bad players, if I'm being honest. Like, I actually think these cards are relatively weak. Tragodia is a bit more flexible because they can like crash and do stuff like that, but always put your opponent in a position where they're forced to do stuff like that versus just handing it to them. These cards are really, really good if you just hand them the Trag or Gors. Then we also have BLS and Chaos Orc. Chaos Orc is just a weaker BLS. You probably seen this card before. Just banishing a monster on the field by banishing a light and a dark. All your monsters are light and darks. And then BLS, has a bit more OTK potential. Is definitely a very strong card. But also, this card is hard wounded by Valor. In fact, most of the cards in this deck are very hard wounded by Valor. And then the last thing we need to mention is, instead of Effect Valor, some people use Effect Valor, some people use Herald of Orange Light. Herald of Orange Light is pretty potent just because of the fact that you can pitch, 2 fairy monsters to negate an effect and destroy the monster. So if you have a deck that's like heavily effect reliant, this card can be really, really pesky to deal with. So for the most part, this deck really doesn't actually run any back row. The only card being Treacherous Trap Hole, or some people do Dust Shoot or like Torrential, but it's typically a one of trap card. So you can also know that relatively you're pretty safe to do whatever you want versus the deck, but just be aware that cards like this or Torrential or even Dust Shoot could be present when making a push. So maybe slamming an MST on the one of back row isn't a bad idea. So one thing that I like to do when playing against agents that you can do as well is, if you're playing against agents and you're worried about a Treacherous or something and you don't want to push too hard, what you can do is you can just set a back row, set your own MST or something of the sort, and then typically your opponent, the agent player, is going to end phase MST your card, which is going to reveal what their back row is, right? So that's what I do. I'll just set a back row and pass and then look for a play on the next turn, just because if it's Treacherous, then they're obviously not going to do anything, and then you can just look to MST it or play around it or play accordingly, right? So that's kind of the first tip to playing around their back row, but it is kind of relevant. They rarely have anything. All right, now as I said, what I'm going to show you, you probably can't unsee once you see this, and this is again what I think kind of dismantles agents as a whole, at least for me, where I personally don't actually think it's that threatening of a deck. So when you look at this deck, you see a bunch of cards that kind of do some stuff, right? But I personally only see about 5 cards that do stuff, right? The main card being Hyperion as a card that can pop stuff, Christia that prevents you from special summoning, BLS, and Chaos Orc. And then lastly, Honest. Honest is the one outlier in this deck where that can kind of change factors in situations. But these cards are the only cards that actually do something in the deck. For example, if your opponent summons the Earth and gets a Venus, I don't really care about that. If my opponent summons Venus and gets Shine Balls and makes Gotchi, I also don't care about that. It's like the same concept of, if my opponent normal summons a Gene Warped Werewolf, a nice little 2K vanilla, do I care? Not really. It doesn't actually do anything, especially compared to what other decks in Tengu can do. I don't really care when their monsters do stuff. Even Tour Guide, the most threatening thing it can do in this deck is Leviair something back, and that is kind of threatening, so sometimes you have to be conscious of Leviair plays, but for the most part, the biggest thing they can do is just make a Leviathan Dragon, and again, a 2500 vanilla basically. I don't care about that. So, one thing that I've noticed a lot of people fall into when playing against agents is with cards like Effect Valor or, Solemn Warning. Any of their negation tools they have, they'll typically use them on cards like Venus or Earth, and even the Tour Guide. You'll Valor those cards because you don't want them to resolve. But my advice, this is my key number 1 tip to play against agents, is stop doing that. It doesn't actually accomplish anything. You can Valor a Venus, but they have 3 in deck. The reality is, eventually, the Venus will resolve in the game. They will summon all 3 Shine Balls, and they will get to play the game with their big Gotchi. But the problem is again, the 2K beater and the Gotchi don't actually do anything. The biggest threat to you at any given point in the game that is actually going to blow you out and win the game is going to be the Hyperion, the Chaos Orc, the BLS, and Christia Valor is less effective against Christia, that's for more so for warnings. But basically, if you hold those cards and wait for them to be forced to use a boss monster, then this deck actually only has a few cards that are actually useful, and those cards all are hard draws, right? So we have literally 5 hard draws right here. So if you hold your Valors, how many of these cards can they actually have in their hand and be useful at a given time, right? It's actually really easy to deal with a single Hyperion if you have, especially if you have Valor, but in general, it's pretty easy to deal with a single one. It gets overwhelming when they have multiple, but again, if you're always saving your negation for specifically these cards, that's pretty much the only concern. The last card in my topic of cards that I think are useful is we have like cards like Honest, and I guess we could also make a case for Herald of Orange Light, right? So Honest, this is a card that you just need to be consciously aware of. Any deck that plays Honest, you then have to try to think of ways to play around it. Just assume your opponent always has it, and then, swing in with cards you don't care about if they Honest and kill, right? So, or use things like Catastor. Catastor is phenomenal against agents. Probably one of the best cards versus agents. And then, same with Herald of Orange Light. This is a card that I think is really strong, but one of its big glaring weaknesses is it's only strong the one time, right? So if your opponent has Herald of Orange Light, let's say you make a monster, like summon a tour guide, they Herald of Orange Light, right? Because that costs 2 cards out of their hand, as a gambling man, I would place a bet that they don't have another 2 fairy monsters, like another Herald and another fairy monster that they'd want to pitch, right? So like even if they pitch like Herald and a Shine Ball, right, that's like their ideal situation. If they have a second, they're probably pitching a Hyperion or one of those useful cards to use it. So even if they do, I don't necessarily care if that happens, but also because of just hand size limitations, I find it very unlikely that they would have a second Herald or be able to play a second Herald. So in other words, if you bait this card out, then you have opportunities to go for things like Trish or stuff like that, because you can feel relatively safe that they're not going to have a second, and even if they do, is it going to be playable, right? So that's another thing to consider when playing against this deck, is if it's not on Valor, then Herald of Orange Light is actually pseudo-exploitable in the matchup. You can play around it and think about like, hey, as soon as I see it, I know they probably don't have another form of effect negation, and if they do, they're burning basically their entire hand to do it. So my first 2 bits of advice is going to be hold your effect Valors and summon negation for boss monsters and let the smaller monsters resolve. As I pointed out, most of the smaller monsters don't actually accomplish all that much and aren't that threatening to your game for most of the decks you're playing, right? I don't really care if my opponent gets a 2k beater on the field, nor do I care if my opponent summons a tour guide and gets a Sangan. The only way I do care about that is if they can make a really good Leviair play, but for the most part, I want my Valors to be used and my warnings to be used on Hyperion, on BLS, Chaos Orc, or even Trishula, right? Those are the cards that you actually want to have those for, and nothing feels worse than wasting a summon negation like a warning on a Venus and having your opponent immediately summon Hyperion after that. The deck is oversaturated with cards like Venus, Tour Guide, all these like kind of generically mediocre normal summons, and as a result, if you just let them do their thing, you're probably not going to get blown out as much by the cards that actually do relevant effects. The second tip is going to be use the least important effects that you have first to try to bait out Herald of Orange Light and make your bigger extensions once it's gone. As I already explained, if Herald of Orange Light is used, it's unlikely they have a second one, and even if they do, they're probably pitching something very useful to do it, as well as basically their entire hand, because 4 cards out of the hand is a lot, and that can put your opponent in a really awkward spot. Now, another big problem that agents have is tempo. If they do not have board control, then a lot of their normal summons become even more underwhelming than they already kind of are. So, for example, especially when it comes to cards like Earth, if I, as a Tengu plant player, have Reborn Tengu on the field and my agent opponent's best play is normal summon Earth to get their engine going, that feels really, really bad for the agent player, because while they do get the Venus to their hand, they're not going to be able to use that Venus that same turn, and then I, as the Tengu plant player, will have agency to do something to punish them on the following turn, or advance my board state, or make things even more threatening. Even potentially OTK, or whatever you want to call it, completely depends on the deck you're playing, but it puts them in a very, very bad spot if they only have things like this. Same thing kind of applies to Tour Guide into Sangan, for example. If that's the best way to get your engine going, and I already have board control, then you're kind of forced to just make a Leviathan Dragon and, attack over my monster. You don't really necessarily want to just leave the Sangan on the field, because I'll have the agency to punish that on the following turn, especially when it comes to decks like Tengu plants, like a Tribute for Caius or something like that goes really, really hard in the matchup, right? So that's something to think about as well, is agents are only really strong if they already have established board control. Now let's take this a bit further and play this out in a scenario that I kind of already talked about of letting your opponent's stuff resolve, right? So we currently have a situation where my best play as the Tengu plant player is just to set the Spirit Reaper and pass. I don't have a way to deal with this Earth, right? So if my agent opponent's next play is just normal summon the Venus and then use its effect to summon 3 Shine Balls, well, that's where things get scary. But let's see what the worst case scenario is if I just let this resolve, right? Now, obviously, if they have a full hand and Herald of Orange Light is really threatening, you could get punished here. But, typically the best play you're going to see come out of this is they're either going to double Gotchi, what doesn't really do anything, or they're going to go for a Synchro into 9 into Trishula, right? So even if I let this all go through, they get to special summon the Trish, and then I can Valor the Trishula, and nothing really comes from it, right? Then the Trishula doesn't actually offer anything to their board. It doesn't really do anything in this scenario because its effect is already gone. Now, this only gets significantly worse if they also have a Christia to play, where they can special summon because they have exactly 4 fairies, but you get the idea, right? You can typically tend to manipulate your opponent's graveyard or kind of like watch and be wary of what their options are. But for the most part, just by Valoring at the right time, none of this stuff actually mattered until it did, and that's when the Valor comes into fruition. And that's going to apply in a lot of ways in this matchup, but this is where, again, tempo can make a world of a difference. For an agent player is if they already have the agency to make a play or like Synchro or something like that, that's when things get a bit scary, and sometimes it could be worth to drop a Valor if you feel like you need to, but for the most part, you just want to Valor the threat they're bringing out, not the initial monsters here. And just as a reminder, basically everything agents do is coming off of a normal summon. So after these summons are done, outside of exactly having the extenders of like Hyperion, BLS Chaos Sork, which again are all hard draws, they really don't have a lot of gas in the tank to do anything else. So assuming the summons of these monsters don't actually do anything to hurt your board, it's honestly not a concern. And even if they do manage to have like a single Hyperion, it doesn't really matter unless they're going to be able to push for game. But again, if you're holding your negation, your Valors, you should be able to handle that situation. The only time it gets dicey is if they have multiple boss monsters in their hand. Like if they open triple Hyperion, can summon all 3, which even then requires a lot of graveyard resources and is a little spicy to like see happen. So it's like nothing, like basically versus agents, the only thing that really like will hard lose you a game is if they open the nuts, but that's going to apply to virtually every deck. The next strategy you should be using to defeat agents is going to be make Catastor and protect it. As I said, Catastor is far and away the best card versus agents because one, it can swing over any of their boss monsters, and it also plays around Honest flawlessly. So this card is literally the best card in the matchup, which means you should put a big emphasis on trying to summon that card and then protect it. So let's jump back into the build so I can once again emphasize just how importantly crucial Catastor is to the agent matchup. The first glaring thing that it does is it perfectly plays around Honest. Honest is never a concern with Catastor on the field because of the fact that, it doesn't go through battle damage. It's just going to destroy at the start of the damage step. The other nice thing about it is if your opponent has a Gotchi, if you attack the Gotchi, Catastor is going to trigger, pop it, and then the battle's going to go through and you're going to get a second detach. So it clears 2 materials on Gotchi, which is very, very strong. And then lastly, it swings over literally all of the boss monsters, including Christia. So it actually makes Christia less of an option for the agent player. If you have Catastor on field, they can't actually summon this card, or even if they do, you're just going to out it and then put it on top of their deck. So unless they have some way to loop destruction, as in constantly bring back a Hyperion, then it's not actually going to work out for them, right? Like they can't really do anything. So again, we bring it back and simplify it back down to what cards in the deck can actually out Catastor, and it's going to be Hyperion, BLS, and Chaos Sork. So again, if we're holding our negation and following the first couple steps of I'm not going to Valor anything except those cards, now Catastor becomes a massive threat that is very difficult to deal with. The other nice thing about it is versus pretty much every card except for Tour Guide and Sanguine, you're not going to be able to inflict battle damage with the Catastor, as in you can choose when to let your opponent summon Tragoedia. So again, you can build a board that's going to enable you to out a Tragoedia if they drop it, or even like a Gorz, and that's when you can start swinging directly. Otherwise, you can just keep killing monsters they have on their field, which is really, really strong. So your opponent basically has to force Tragoedia on you to try to out your Catastor by like summoning Tour Guide and crashing or something, and that doesn't feel very good, right? So that's why Catastor is just so insanely broken versus this deck. And this also goes back to the only threat to the Catastor is going to be Herald of Orange Light. Outside of exactly the boss monster pops, which you should be holding negation for, Herald of Orange Light is the only primary problem. Obviously, having a copy of Monster Reborn is going to deal with this, but a card I really like to use, which I think is a very, very good side card versus agents, is going to be My Body is a Shield. This card is really, really powerful because it has the effect of when your opponent activates spell, trap, or monster effect that would destroy a monster or monsters on the field, pay 1,500 life points, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. This card is really, really good because it's a quick play spell, so it includes things like, let's say I synchro into Trishula and my opponent activates Herald of Orange Light. If I My Body that, I not only kill 2 cards out of their hand, I also get Trishula's effect to resolve because it negates the activation of Herald of Orange Light. So your effect isn't negated, which is really, really broken, right? So this is just something to think about as a card that can help you. Again, this is another phenomenal card to help you protect a Catastor. I think this is one of the better side cards or even main cards, depending on the deck you're playing, against agents, because if you have a Catastor on board and you have a My Body set, if they summon Hyperion, they're forced to try to banish and pop your Catastor, in which case My Body as a Shield is going to blow them out. So this is a really phenomenal side card, depending on what deck you're playing, that can deal with the final problem that agents have, which is going to be Herald of Orange Light. But for the most part, following my steps and these ideas is really going to kind of blow this deck out of the water. As you can see, once we simplify it down to those like basic fundamental plays, the deck really doesn't do all that much. And that means that there's a lot of windows for counterplay and a lot of easy ways to deal with it. Now, before I get flamed in the comments, obviously there are other cards that out Catastor in the deck, such as like Dark Hole, a Mind Control play, or even Treacherous Trap Hole. But again, these are typically just one-ofs, and you know, they're a lot less reliable for your opponent to always have, which is why I'm kind of focusing more on like what the generic average game is going to look like, not necessarily operating on the assumption my opponent always have Mind Control or Dark Hole, just because, you know, those are pretty powerful, potent one-ofs. Mind Control obviously has like no counterplay. It's like the best card in the entire format. But that being said, Treacherous Trap Hole for things like this, or even if they're on Torrential, just remember, don't summon a second monster unless you are certain they don't have a back row. Typically, they're not setting a lot of back rows. So if they have this set, or if they have a single back row set, you know, try to MST it, or don't summon another monster until they, you know, reveal what their back row is. Because basically, for example, if you only have the Catastor on your side of the field and they have a set Treacherous, the only way for them to kill the Catastor with the Treacherous is they have to summon their own monster and pop it. So you see this card, it says target 2 monsters on the field, destroy those targets. They have to do it. Or in the same sense of Torrential, if it's a Torrential set, they have to summon another monster and then Torrential their own normal summon. And that is relatively fine, right? Like, that's pretty costly to them. So that's just something to keep in mind to play against them. Dark Hole, cards like My Body, stuff is going to deal with it. But again, it's a little more niche. But I figured I should at least put the disclaimer before people go like, oh, well, you could get Mind Control. I know. So my last little bit of generic advice is going to be, do not let them summon Gorz or Trag unless you have an out. In other words, avoid attacking directly or inflicting battle damage if they have a large hand. Watch their graveyard carefully to track Christia/Hyperion into Christia, as well as number of Hyperion pops. Just remember, let's say they have 5 fairies in their graveyard, including at least 1 agent monster. If you see that that's what's happening, then that means they have the potential to banish to summon Hyperion and then special Christia, then pop. So keep that in mind. And then lastly, have a strong side prepared based on the deck you are playing. And there's a lot of cards that I think people get baited into as like generic good cards against agents that aren't actually that good for the deck they are playing. So we'll kind of go into real quick and talk about what cards I think are good to side against agents before we move on to Tengu plants. All right, so let's move on to cards that you can generically side against agents. The first one I want to talk about is Max C. A lot of people put this in versus agents. Don't fucking do that. I mean, does it have some merit? Kind of, right? Like, for example, it is going to stop the Venus in summoning a Shine Ball. They're going to stop right there, so you're going to replace self, draw one, stop the play, which is like, okay, but as I explained, we don't really care about them summoning the Gotchi, and it's almost better to just let them do it, to just get it out and out of the way. But that being said, you know, again, since it is replacing itself, there is some merit. It's like okay, I guess. With Tour Guide, like, the only way it's going to be relevant is if you can hit the Tour Guide into like a Leviathan or Levier. That's when it's going to be strong. But for the most part, they're just going to summon a Sangan and pass. So this card's just going to be infinitely less useful than majority of the other cards you could put in versus agents, on top of the fact that all their summons outside of like the Tour Guide and the Venus like Shine Balls, they're all inherent summons, so nothing's gonna like, you're not gonna be able to draw a lot of cards or see a lot of value off of the Maxi, nor are you gonna interrupt a lot of plays. And then Birdman, this card is like Maxiable, but I would assume most agent players side this out by game 2, so you know, it's just, I would heavily advise against it. There are just a lot better cards. One of the better cards is going to be Effect Veiler. As I already talked about, this is like a core card to the plan of beating agents. This card is insane. It's really, really broken. I would heavily encourage you, at least between main and side, being maxed out on 3 copies of this card in virtually any deck you're playing outside of like exactly like a really stun deck that's already on like Skill Drain or something like that. But Veiler is a really viable option. Then we have Thunder King. This card's really good because outside of, you know, Venus into the Shine Ball into the Gotchi turn 1, basically all their normal summons are walled off by exactly Thunder King, and they can't summon their boss monsters while you have Thunder King on the field. This is really good, and especially because a lot of decks are on Duality for some reason. So, you know, if you turn 1 Thunder King, then you could basically virtually shut off their entire hand or their ability to play the game. So that's a nice little card. Another card is Kaiku. I like this card because they can't banish to summon Hyperion from their graveyard, and you also can control their graveyard, so you can start denying resources as you do damage. Again, most of the monsters they summon are pretty low attack, such as like Tour Guide or Earth, with the exception of exactly Venus if they have the Gotchi. But you can pretty easily inflict battle damage on your opponent and start banishing cards in their graveyard, and that's going to really cut off the resources that agents have. Then the last card is going to be King Tiger Wangu. This card's really good because if you look at every normal summon they have, this walls off every single normal summon they could possibly do. They can summon Venus, but they can't get the Shine Balls. The only exception to this rule is exactly Jupiter, but for the most part, they don't really have a solid out to King Tiger Wangu. Like, there's really nothing they can do other than like special summon a Hyperion, like from the by banishing from the hand or something and swinging over. It's really awkward for agents to deal with King Tiger Wangu. So that's another phenomenal side card versus the deck. Leeching the Light. This is a card that I think people get baited by. It is really, really good if your deck can swarm. So, for example, agents should probably side this card because if you play the mirror match, you could summon a Venus, get 3 Shine Balls on the board, and then leeching, and you can do a ton of damage in a single turn, right? It's really good for decks that swarm in OTK, but if your deck is slower or more control-based, don't play Leeching the Light. It's just not worth it. Again, there's just better cards to run. MST is one I wanted to put in here just to talk about because of the fact that if you're a deck that is on like a lot of back row, like if you run a lot of back row, almost every single agent deck sides Decree. So you want to have a counter side of MST versus agents to do that. In addition, some of them will side in back row in games 2 and 3. So it doesn't hurt to have like a couple copies of this card, especially if you're a back row deck. I would actually have to side in 3 versus the agent matchup because you're afraid of the Decree, right? My Body, I already talked about. It's insane. It deals with Hyperion. It deals with Herald of Orange Light. And, you know, also is like a little... It deals with scraps really well, like Scrap Dragon, for example. You can even pop a Scrap Dragon that's trying to target your back row because it just says monsters on the field. So if a Scrap Dragon is targeting like a Tengu and then a back row, like their Tengu, you can protect their Tengu with the My Body and pop the Scrap Dragon. It's came up for me before. Really random, but really cool. Debunk. This card's just really good at dealing with like the Gores and Trag, gives you out to that, and also a great way to deal with Herald of Orange Light and Honest. So this is kind of a nice way to deal with the cards that have a bit of uncertainty, like cards in the hand. Chaos Trap Hole, this card's really good against agents because no matter what they summon, you can banish it. So for example, it's actually not terrible if like you think their only play is summon Earth, you could like negate the Earth and banish it, and then they don't have the resource for a Hyperion extension later. But overall, it's basically just an extra copy of Solemn Warning, which I think is generically pretty good for most decks to run. Light Imprisoning Mirror, most of the monsters that are relevant or do anything in this deck are light, with the exception of exactly like Chaos Orc, Tour Guide, and then the Tragodia line, right? So if you side Light Imprisoning Mirror, then these guys just become big dinkuses. They don't actually do anything. None of their monsters do anything. So it's a pretty strong card if you have the room for it, and if you like can effectively run a lot of back row. I would run this in like control decks. On this card is if you don't actually run a lot of back row and you think they would side out their MSTs versus you, I think Imperial Ironwall goes really hard versus agents. They can't banish to summon Hyperion, they can't banish Light and Dark for Chaos Sork or BLS, and if they do have them on the field, they can't banish the pop because you have Imperial Ironwall, right? So this card is just weirdly really good against a lot of random stuff, and I think this is like a great example of a deck that it would like go pretty well into. Then we have Trap Dust Shoot and Mind Crush. These two go together. Typically, you'll see people side 2 Mind Crush and the Trap Dust Shoot. Agents always have a really big hand of cards. So you can use these cards to get information. Like, for example, your opponent summons a Earth and gets a Venus. You could then activate Mind Crush, call Venus, guaranteed get the card, and see the rest of their hand so you can know what to play around. Same thing goes for Dust Shoot. I like whether a lot of people side this out if you're going second versus agent. That's not the correct play because agents always have a big hand. They don't play a lot of back row. So Trap Dust Shoot should almost always be live in the agent matchup, which is why it's really, really strong. Again, getting that information, knowing how many boss monsters you have to play around, when to use your negation. That information is just invaluable. And then the last card is Black Horn of Heaven. Again, we just have a bunch of inherent summon monsters that are really powerful, like, you know, Christia, Hyperion, BLS, Chaos Orc. Having the Black Horn to prevent one of those boss monsters can be critical, and it has no cost to it. You know, there's no life point cost like Warning or Chaos Trap Hole, so it's another great option. So these are the cards I would recommend to side against agents. Yeah, it's a lot, but again, just kind of base it on what type of deck you have or what style of deck you have, and, you know, play accordingly. But for the most part, this is going to be really, really good. I definitely recommend like Dust Shoot at the very least. This card is like phenomenal as a generic card against a lot of decks like Chaos or Agents that have big hands. Lastly, guys, just remember, the deck is inherently bricky. It runs 3 vanillas, so there's a lot of ways that this deck can brick or be borderline unplayable for the person playing it. It's not just all flash and flare. It looks really good when it looks really good, if it goes off. But again, people making mistakes, I feel like, is what leads to this deck being inflated in terms of strength. If you kind of go through my advice and my points, you should win a lot more games against agents and even find the matchup relatively easy. I know I personally don't really struggle with it as much as a lot of people talk about. Like, I hear a lot of people say, oh, my deck's worst matchup is agents, and I always just I'm like, how? You know what I'm saying? So hopefully this helps. But now let's jump over to talk about Tengu Plants. I'll try to make it quick because this video is already getting kind of long. Tengu Plants is a stack of good cards and 1-ups that somehow coherently work together. The deck is considered tier 0 by some, and if I'm being honest, I find this deck to be way more threatening than the likes of agents. Tengu Plants has the most variance out of every deck in the format. Playing versus it feels like it's either the worst deck in the format or the best, depending on your opponent's draws. Let's look at the baseline build for Plants to get things started. Alright, so the baseline build for Tengu Plants is going to be the standard Billy Break build. You could honestly full send this deck into a tournament and do relatively fine. This build was honestly pretty ideal for Tengu Plants, and there's very, very little room for innovation with how you approach building this deck. You'll occasionally see someone spice up the trap lineup, maybe adding like Dimensional Prison or Mirror Force just because people don't expect it. You'll see people bump Thunder King to 3, bump Econ to 3, reduce Econ to 1. You know, there's all kinds of different ways people approach it, but for the most part, the core you're seeing here is going to be what you're going to be playing against whenever you run into Plants. And one thing to note is over 50% of the deck consists of literal 1-ofs. So it is a really weird deck to play against, because one thing I always feel like when I play Yu-Gi-Oh! Is I'm always kind of expecting the worst case scenario and then hoping for the best, right? But to my knowledge of playing against Tengu plants is 9 times out of 10, if you think they have the most ideal one-up for the situation, they probably do. So it's really smart to try to play around that. But it is a very weird deck to kind of talk about, but we will try to get into and look at like what are the best ways to counterplay what exactly this deck does. Alright, so let's go over a few of the primary cards. The big one is going to be Reborn Tengu himself. This face-up card leaves the field. Special summon 1 Reborn Tengu from your deck. This card is the most annoying part of Tengu plants because this, plus any of their tuners, opens up a whole can of worms of them being able to summon a bunch of monsters from their deck. They also rely on Tour Guide just to basically get Sangan and typically search out whatever they need from their like weenie monsters, such as, you know, Dandy, Lone Fire, or Debris. Typically Lone Fire is like one of the best targets for Sangan search because it can convert into any of these 3 cards right here. Lone Fire is also really insane in this deck. They also just abuse some of the better normal summons in the game, such as Thunder King Ryo, and since they're able to put tokens and like a lot of floaters on the field pretty easily, Caius also goes really hard in this deck. Like I said, it's not as simple as Agents in the sense that it like doesn't just do like one linear thing. This deck has a lot of different options in a single game of what they can do, and that's why we have to kind of address it in a different manner. So the first thing Tengu plans typically are looking to do is they want to establish board control with a Reborn Tengu, right? They want to stick a Tengu, and once they have that Tengu on board, they're going to try to use that Tengu to convert into a bigger play on the following turn, which is typically going to be summoning a tuner, making a synchro play, or tributing for Caius to like banish one of your monsters. It's really pesky and annoying, but we can also kind of look at exactly what lines they're able to go into. For example, for the most part, Tengu plant players are going to synchro into Librarian, maybe Librarian and Catasaur for a draw 1. They also have the option of like Librarian Formula if they have like a really insane hand. Typically 1-for-1 is required to pull that off, which is going to get them like a draw 2. It's going to go really hard, but it's super vulnerable to the likes of Max C. The other card that they're going to be using a lot of is going to be like, for example, Spore. There's really cool plays. If you can like Lone Fire into Spore, then you can Synchro for 5 into Librarian, then activate Spore's effect, banish the Lone Fire, Synchro for 8 into like Stardust or Scrap Dragon, then draw a card. All kinds of different unique combos that can come out into fruition. But the biggest thing is most of that is all going to rely on Reborn Tengu sitting and sticking on the field. So one of my first pieces of advice is going to be try to avoid letting them stick a Tengu, hitting it with a Solemn Warning, or finding ways to go out of your way and just blow out as many copies of Tengu in a single turn is really, really important. You do not want them to have this card floating around for long because it's going to convert into so many plays. Not to mention the fact that this card can be tributed for enemy controller to steal your monsters and even get another Tengu, since Tengu is almost always replacing itself. So there's a lot of different ways to get rid of Tengu. If it's already established on the field, setting it face down with like a Book of Moon and then like destroying it with like a Dark Hole or Torrential is a way to get rid of it, which is kind of nice. But in a less like minussy way, if you have like a Phoenix Wing Wind Blast or like a Ryza, you can spin this card to the top of the deck and it won't trigger its effect, which is really nice. But this is like the core card that like once you clear through the Tengus, the deck becomes infinitely less threatening. This card is like where all their combos and synchro plays come from. For the likes of Thunder Kings, if your deck is a deck that gets really hurt by Thunder King, then you want to run a lot of outs to it. So you should ideally have something prepared for this in your main deck anyway. So basically, the biggest core concept of plants is going to revolve around them normal summoning Tengu and you trying to prevent it. That being said, there's also a lot of cards that are pretty good to Veiler. I would say this deck is a polar opposite to Agents, where before when I said you want a Veiler, they're big monsters. This deck's boss monsters is literally like Caius and BLS, and while you do probably want to Veiler those cards, it's also very acceptable to want a Veiler Tour Guide in this deck because, like I said before, Sangan searching Lone Fire, if you don't have a direct out to their Sangan, then the Lone Fire plus Tengu just opens up so much for your opponent to do when they're playing Tengu plants. So my advice would be to actually Veiler the Tour Guides to avoid Sangan from getting out, or even try to find a way to out the Sangan. Do not give them Sangan Search. In fact, sometimes it's better to just pass and leave it, because if it's summoned off Tour Guide, they can't synchro with it anyway. So the goal would be to force them to exceed with it, because as soon as this searches like either debris, if they have like Foolish and Dandy to make like a free 1-card Trish, or if they can search Lone Fire with a Tengu, that's when things are going to get really, really hard for you. So first line of advice is prevent the Sangan from going through. This card's actually like one of the best cards that Tengu Plants has, which is why it is a little scary. So just avoid letting that search happen and stay aware of what your opponent can do. Valor is very potent against a lot of cards, especially Debris Dragon, but this is the one deck where Max C is also pretty relevant in dealing with what your opponent's trying to do. So my first few points on how to approach beating Tengu Plants is avoid letting them stick a Tengu on the field. Using your Solemn Warning on the summon or trying to steal it and XYZ summon with it is going to be one of your best bets to prevent that card from sticking there. Also, you can, like I said, Book of Moon, like set it face down and then find a way to destroy it, or even spin it with like a Ryza or a Phoenix Wing, but those are kind of less common options. So exceeding with it is typically one of the better ones, or just Solemn Warning the summon. You do get punished by Monster Reborn, but it is what it is. You can also, again, I've seen players do things like early summon BLS and just try to clear through the Tengus with it so you can remove their options, but that's going to be the biggest playmaker for the deck, so just getting rid of Tengu is going to go a very long way. The other card that you need to avoid is letting them resolve Sangan. Sangan is going to search some of the best cards in their deck, like Debris Dragon or Lone Fire, and you know, it's just kind of a big mess. So I would recommend using Valor on like their tour guides, steal their Sangan and XYZ with it, just like Tengu, or avoid attacking altogether until you find an out like Thunder King, or even like Chaos Orc BLS can banish it, you know what I'm saying? So just make sure that you avoid giving them Sangan search at all costs unless you have a very potent response to their like search. But like I said, I think Lone Fire sets up so much for Tengu Plants that you really want to avoid Lone Fire hitting the field or getting to their hand. Lastly, hold Max C for when you have board control and they are forced to make a push. What this means is if your opponent is forced to make a play to out your board, then they typically have to spend more resources special summoning, which means you're going to see more value out of your Max C. One thing I've learned since playing Max C is Tengu Plants actually have a lot of phenomenal stopping points, and unless you have some form of threat or board control already established, they can easily just stop and pass. So you want to make sure that you are playing a deck that typically has some form of threat or board control on the following turn if they don't make the extension. So an example I can give is when I played X-Saber, since the deck kind of just sets monsters and stalls until it can make a bigger board, and once it makes that big board, it's hard winning. I found that Max C felt a little bit less effective against Tengu Plants because it didn't actually help me regain board control, and my opponent had a lot of very good stopping points since I wasn't presenting any threats until my combo was beginning. So for the most part, you want to try to play decks that are really good at establishing board control. Like for example, I think in Scraps are really good at just setting up a Scrap Dragon and putting up a threat on the next turn, which means Max C goes really hard against the likes of Tengu Plants if they're trying to make a push to try to prevent you from summoning a Scrap Dragon or even to deal with the Scrap Dragon. It's pretty powerful. So just to demonstrate the point, as you can see, I currently have no board control but a Max C. Let's say my opponent activates 1-for-1 and pitches a Spore to special summon out a Glow-Up Bulb, and I decide to chain my Max C. If I do it right here, they special summon the Glow-Up Bulb, I get to draw one card, and then they're probably just going to pass, which obviously doesn't really feel all that good and doesn't really do anything, especially if I do not have a way to out this board on the following turn. For example, even if I were to kill the Glow Bulb, on the next turn they can still mill and bring it back, or if I kill the Tengu, then they're just going to get another one. So this is kind of like an awkward problem you have if you don't already have board control, but you know, we can show this once again. So as you can see, if we make that same play, except I obviously have board control, then this is where Max C becomes infinitely more threatening because they're going for this play and they desperately need this to go through because they need to out my Scrap Dragon, right? So here I get to draw a card, then they have to synchro into the Catastor that's going to out the Scrap Dragon, that's going to give me another draw, and then they're going to special summon Tengu because they have to, and that's going to give me my third draw. So obviously pretty potent, pretty powerful, and that's why Max C is only relatively good if you have some form of board control and you're able to hold it. And obviously in the first play, just by doing the Max C and doing the 1-for-1, you do technically stop their play, but in my opinion, you're only really prolonging it or delaying it a bit. and that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to just draw an immediate out to the situation, which is why, again, I feel like Maxi is just inherently better if you have some type of board control, so it's just something to keep in mind. Some other cards you can use to try to deal with Tengu plants is just generically making a TG Hyper Librarian. This card will sort of pseudo floodgate out Tengu plants, where if they're forced to make a synchro play, then you're going to get to draw off of it. This is really good unless they have exactly cards like Enemy Controller or even worse, Mind Control, in which case they can steal your Librarian and then synchro and get a bunch of draws off of it. So it is something to be wary about, is if they have a lot of cards in their hand and therefore potentially a lot of options, or you haven't seen Mind Control yet, this is something to be kind of cautious of when summoning the TG Hyper Librarian. Moving on to my next set of points, use cards like Thunder King and Librarian to wall off plays. These cards are obviously really insane, but Thunder King specifically, if you're able to protect it, it kind of has the same effect as like Catastor versus Agents, where your opponent is going to be forced to make bigger plays to out it, like outside of exactly crashing their own Thunder King. Tengu plants do not have very good outs to Thunder King, so it's really, really powerful to like try to keep and stick on the board. So even in open game states, if there's a Thunder King in graveyard, it's not terrible to Monster Reborn a Thunder King just to reestablish the board control of it on your field versus the likes of Tengu plants. The other thing to keep in mind is watch their graveyard carefully for BLS opportunities. BLS is a one-of in the deck, and unlike the likes of Agents where you can kind of be prepared and thinking about boss monsters and holding your negation for them, with Tengu plants you actually have to use your negation on their other monsters, which means BLS can be a major threat. So you have to be kind of conscious about it when playing around what they're doing. Just make sure you're aware and ready for BLS if you think they have a light in the dark and they're able to do it. Lastly, we got to side heavily for this matchup. This, again, is one of the most popular decks in the format, so if we side heavily for it, it's pretty easy to beat. Again, it's really good to be prepared for this deck at any tournament you play in that is Tengu plant format, because of the fact that this deck is just so common and pretty strong. And then one other thing I see a lot of people misplay with in the matchup is avoid using Max C if you're going to negate the summon of the monster with the likes of Solemn Warning or Thunder King. So for example, if this Tengu plant player is summoning Tour Guide and you know they have to out your Thunder King by making Leviathan Dragon, if you go chain Max C and they go and summon the Leviathan Dragon from the deck, or the Sengen from the deck to make Leviathan Dragon, then they're going to overlay here, and while you get the first draw from the summon of the Sengen, if they overlay and try to make the Leviathan Dragon and your goal is to negate it, well then whether you Warning or Tribute for Thunder King, the summon won't be successful and you won't get the draw. So that's something to think about too. I see a lot of people make that mistake. If in this situation, it's better to hold the Max C and then just tribute the Thunder King or activate Solemn Warning on the summon if you're trying to protect your Thunder King. Alright, so let's real quick just move on to the cards that you should be siding against Tengu plants. There's honestly a very condensed amount of options. Like for the most part, you're just going to see people side in like Maxis and Thunder Kings because these are like the two most crippling cards for the matchup. But I added a couple other ones that I think are pretty relevant or that are a little spicy. So DD Crow is one that I think is really good. Just the ability to like banish something that like, you know, on the summon of a debris, target it Dandy, get to crow it, or even crow like a Spore or Glow Bulb in the graveyard can honestly go a very long way. It makes a world of a difference. Hitting like Monster Reborn, Call the Haunted, or even Pot of Avarice, that can also go a long way with the DD Crow. So this card's like pretty strong versus plants. They're going to have a tough time like recovering from an interrupted play by a DD Crow, which I think is really nice. Maxi, we've already talked about it. It depends on the deck, honestly. I think generically it's like okay. I would at least run like 1 or 2. And then 3 if you know you're a deck that like is going to be able to utilize it really well in the matchup. Veiler is another card that's phenomenal, again, because we can hit the Tour Guide, we can hit the Caius, you can hit the BLS, you can hit the Debris Dragon. It just kind of interrupts a lot of cards in their deck. Thunder King is just broken. They can't really make a big monster to out the play. Like, the reality is this deck is full of, like, tiny guys, and those tiny monsters can't really get over Thunder King outside of exactly crashing their own Thunder King. So this card is just so annoying for them to deal with, which is why it's really, really good for them to, or really good for you to run this card, especially when going first. King Tiger Wangu, this is like interesting. If you're on a deck that is running like Horn of the Phantom Beast, and this card goes so hard because Crashing Tengu is like the worst case scenario. That feels really, really bad. But other than that, this is another card that walls off like 90% of their summons, which is really, really strong. Then we also have Vanity's Fiend. If you're a deck that contributes summon, like preventing them from special summoning is obviously really insane. And then I added this one. I mean, this kind of represents a lot of different cards. Any card that can like negate the effect of monsters they destroy. A lot of these cards have really good effects when they're sent to the graveyard. So anytime they set a monster, or like with Tengu, those cards get really blown out by the likes of like Dark Ruler Hades, for example. But you know, and like there's like Revive King Hades. There's a lot of different options. Ancient Gear Beast does this. But any card that can like turn off effects when it destroys a monster is going to be really, really powerful. We also have in the spell cards, I have Lance, and then of course like the MST. MST is really nice just because if they're in a more back row heavy, you want the extra copy. And they also side into Decree, so if you're playing a back row deck, you follow the same line of thinking, you know what I'm saying? But Forbidden Lance, I actually have been really liking this card in the Tengu Plant matchup a lot lately. Not only is it going to out their Thunder Kings and some of their like bigger Synchro monsters, but the one thing that it really helps with is I think one of the highest variant cards in the deck for the matchup is going to be cards like Enemy Controller and Mind Control. A well-timed Enemy Controller to steal your monster can feel terrible, and Lance is like a phenomenal way to play around that. It's like one of the only ways you can play around that. So this is a card I think is definitely worthwhile in the plant matchup, especially if you see them on heavy Enemy Controller, because this card's just like one of the best cards in the deck in my opinion. Then we also have Debunk, because they have so many graveyard effects. Like you could even debunk the Sangan effect if you need to, but like they got like Sangan, they got Dandy, they got Spore, they got Glow Up, and they even run cards like Gores, and you can even debunk the Tengu effect. This card's really, really good at just dealing with a lot of what Tengu plants do, and the fact that it banishes means it's kind of removing the issue as well. Vanity's Emptiness, this card's kind of awkward, but it is pretty good if you can find a time where they don't have MSC. I would just recommend not setting other back row with it. I would just set this as a single card, and then if they summon a tour guide or something, this is a great card to like chain to what they're doing. If you have decks that can play them, Rivalry and Gozen are really good against these decks, since they're just a bunch of generic like random cards. None of them actually have similar like types or attributes, so Rivalry and Gozen really hard wall off what Tengu plants can do, and if they don't have an out, they're probably going to lose to it. Then going back to cards like Black Horn of Heaven. Black Horn of Heaven is like, you know, it's a given. They make a lot of synchro plays. They special summon a lot of monsters. This is a really good card to just kind of deal with what they're doing and like do it for free. And then Deck Devastation Virus. If you got a deck that can like use this, specifically a dark focus deck, again, most of their cards in the deck are like weenies. So like outside of exactly the first few right up here, the whole deck just kind of gets wiped from that. Well, yes, you're going to put some of them in the graveyard, like you might put a Glow Bulb in the graveyard, you still could like wipe majority of their hand or just like reduce a lot of their draws, which I think is really, really powerful. So those are kind of my general tips on what to side. You can also do things if your deck's able to do it, like Macro DeFi. Those cards absolutely ruin this deck. But, you know, there's a lot of decks in Tengu Plant that just can't run those cards, which is why I didn't include them in the list. So yeah, that's kind of my general thing for Tengu Plants. Again, this deck doesn't follow the same line as like Agents, where there's like a really clear-cut way to beat it. There's just more so general tips on how to approach Tengu Plants, because again, this deck is pretty high variance, right? Like it's pretty easy to beat in a lot of scenarios if they're like, you know, if they don't see Tengu or something, like, you know, they're gonna have some problems. But it also, you know, again, can look really insane. It just kind of depends on what's happening, and because there's so many one-ofs, there's so many different factors that occur. So general advice is basically the best way to approach playing against Tengu Plants. Again, this deck is really powerful, but it's not like insane. There are some games you're going to play against it and it's just going to feel like it does absolutely nothing, or like everything you do just wipes it. And then there's other games where it just feels like the most broken deck in the game because they just have everything, and that's just kind of how it be. But side cards like this are really going to help swing that matchup or keep things in your favor, especially cards like, again, Maxi and Thunder King. These are going to be the most generic cards that you can use that are going to help deal with Tengu Plants. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know if you find this helpful, if you liked, you know, learning how to beat some of these decks, especially if you're a newer Tengu Plant player and are going to be at YCS Vegas. Be sure to say hi. I love meeting people that, you know, I watch my channel or that I interact with online. It's really cool to kind of put a face to the name, stuff like that. So, you know, I'll be at YCS Vegas. I'll definitely be competing in this tournament. So, you know, if you see me, definitely say hi. Love to meet people. It's a lot of fun to see people who are viewers of my channel. But, you know, let me know if you guys think this was helpful. If there's any other decks you want me to show you how to beat or kind of go over. I know for Agents, there was like a pretty cut and dry, like this is the best way to approach it, while Tengu Plants was a bit more generic and broad. But that's just kind of the nature of the decks. Every deck is going to be different on how you want to approach beating it. But hopefully this was helpful. Regardless, we'll just give a quick shout out to my patrons. So shout out to Grant Johnson, Beast Eyes, Slap God, My Dude, Photo Shooty, Brian Ford, and Sven Olbrahen. Thank you guys so much for the support. This channel would not be a thing without you. So other than that, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and have a great time dueling today.